And now to this evening's talk. We are delighted to have Dr. Roberto Mazza to talk to us about the Crucible of Jerusalem, local dynamics in Palestine during the Great War, 1914 to 1918. Roberto began his academic career at the University of Bologna, and then did a master's and studied for his PhD at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. He is executive editor of the Jerusalem Quarterly and a visiting lecturer at Northwestern University in Chicago. I'm going to leave it there, and perhaps we can come back and learn a bit more about the Jerusalem Quarterly and other things that you do, Roberto. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to hand over to Roberto Mazza.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be part of this series of talks. And I must say that looking at the next speaker, I'm just ashamed of my little work. I mean, it's interesting that you just mentioned the work of Eugene Rogan. And I think there's a very interesting connection here. I just want to make, even before I start my talk, the very fact that he's going to talk about Damascus in 1860, and I'm going to talk about Jerusalem, two cities that are separated by, roughly speaking, 80 miles, 100 miles at most, depending on the roads, whether you go through Lebanon or the back of Jordan. And the two cities have a completely different trajectories and histories, particularly in the late Ottoman era. Damascus underwent a series of riots and incidents between the religious communities of a city. And on the other hand, Jerusalem experienced almost the opposite, where communities found ways of coexisting, but not through an empty coexistence, but through an active coexistence, where communities cooperated together. And Jerusalem experienced incidents similar to 1860s in Damascus only under the British, so past 1920 for the most part. So it's very interesting and fascinating that you are hosting these two talks close to each other and with such different histories and dynamics, and yet they were part of the same empire and experienced World War I and transition to new nation states at the very same time. But at the same period, they're so far away from each other. So let me start now sharing my presentation. Okay, perfect. So what I want to do tonight is to essentially talk about Jerusalem with some references to Palestine in the period between 1914 to 1918. I want to start with a picture here of the Ottoman army that had been mobilized at the beginning of the war. As you can see from this picture, they all have, wearing the same fashion, their uniforms, their fez, their hat, mustache. What is interesting about this picture is that it's hardly impossible to distinguish, it's impossible to distinguish among these men who were the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims. And one would be eager to say that they are all Muslim subjects of the Ottoman Empire. And yet, knowing some of these characters firsthand, there are some Jews and some Christians, which also speaks about, sort of the multi-ethnicity, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-linguistic nature of the Ottoman Empire. And the fact that during the war, we see through some of the characters that I encountered in my own work, religious identity was not as important as ethnic identity turned out to be. Eventually, throughout World War I, being an Arab, being a Turk, being a Kurd, and being part of other minorities became a paramount question of what's going to happen next. And this happened really throughout the world itself. It was widely accepted that during, before World War I, there was an Ottoman Empire with an overarching Ottoman identity, which sort of contained all of the inhabitants of the Ottoman Empire, regardless of a religious or ethnic identity. And of course, locally, people developed their own one. And so World War I became this period of transition to not only new nation states created by the British and the French, but also to new identities based on Arab nationalism. Obviously, in Palestine, also we have the emergence of Zionism, which is a European phenomenon imported from Europe, but obviously, as we know, then created the conditions for the development of the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, and eventually, in time, through the work of other agencies up to 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel. So this is a moment in time that reshaped local identity into national identities. And this process has been studied by scholars in the past. But in the past 20 years, we've seen different interpretations, particularly based on local accounts, and see the complexities of these identities.
Roberto, if I could stop you, the display is showing like a little advertisement, like give subtitles a try, and it's okay. That's got it. Okay, and if you can make it, yeah, that's better now.
Sorry, I thought I was the only one seeing that.
No.
It was in the middle.
And if you can make it full screen as well, that'd be even better. But it only if you can. Thank you.
Sorry. What you're sharing is your speaker notes.
That's strange because what I see is the full screen. So maybe I don't know why.
Reselect your share.
Yeah, I will do that.
That's the speaker notes we're seeing.
That's strange because normally it should show the full presentation. So let's go with this. See what you have a full.
That's it. That's good.
Brilliant. Okay, perfect. So I just to mention a few things about historiography. Often there was a tendency, at least since the end of the war, particularly through the 1940s onwards, so with the creation of the State of Israel, the Nakba, so there was a tendency to look back at this period in time as a formative moment, which on one end painted the Ottomans as some sort of an evil ruler, and so the whole Ottoman history, including the physical heritage and ideological heritage of the era, was completely gone in favor of Arab nationalism and of Zionism. And in the past 20 years, that has been brought back through academic studies, but also popular narrative. And also, there was a tendency, particularly by Western scholars, to paint the arrival of the British as the real moment of modernization of the region. And again, in the past 20 years, since the beginning of the early 2000s, Palestinian scholars, but also some Israeli scholars, from Ilan Pappé, before it became sort of a household name more for political reasons than historical one, Benny Morris, particularly working on 1948, but also some early works on the Ottoman times, Hillel Cohen, very important Israeli historians of this period of time, and Salim Tamari, Bishara Dumani, Sam Nattar, so more Palestinian scholars and Western scholars like Michel Campos. They start looking at, well, modernity was a byproduct of the Ottoman era. The British just, and I'm using a term that was used by some of the scholars, piggyback on what the Ottomans already produced. And I like this picture because then it's going to parallel with a picture at the end. This is a 1898 picture of a visit of a Kaiser, Wilhelm II, to Jerusalem. He visited the city in 1898. And you can see from the picture already a number of services offered to travelers. So, this is a good quality pictures, and you can see some of the signs, the Nicodem, or, on the side there is a hostel, there are banks, post offices, and, this is the processions that follow the entrance into the city through Jaffa Gate, an historic moment for the city of Jerusalem. And again, this is highly associated with modernity because the city had already been modernized with the train stations, postal services, bank services, services for tourists, pilgrims. And so it speaks about a city that was already thriving well before the arrival of the British in 1980. But I want to move quickly to, give you a sense of how Jerusalem and Palestine looked like before World War I And so we need to look at the broader context. Obviously, Jerusalem was a city, part of the Ottoman Empire, an Ottoman Empire that had been ruled for about 30 years by Abdulhamid II, one of these, sort of the last despotic ruler of the Ottoman Empire. In 1908, Sultan Abdulhamid II was deposed by a military, including civilian revolution, which established a new constitution and eventually new form of governments where the Sultan had only minimal power. Now, what is interesting is that in 1908, we have elections in the Ottoman Empire, which by the accounts and the standards of the day were fairly open, where men of a certain age and a certain census were allowed to vote regardless of their religious and ethnic identity. Jerusalem sent a number of deputies. Palestine altogether also sent a Jewish deputy. There was also a Jewish deputy from Salonika and one from Istanbul. Obviously, we have Christians in the parliament, not just Armenians, but also Arab Christians. So it's really a moment of transformation. And yet we have to think about that these young Turks that led the revolutions were also eager to save the empire in any way possible. These men were fairly young, in their 30s, mostly educated in Western schools, for the most part in France, and they were eager to make changes for the empire, to save the empire. However, it would be wrong to think that this is like some sort of a pivotal moment in the history of Palestine and Jerusalem, which certainly was, but one of the most important moments in the history of the region actually dates back to the 1840s, when the Egyptians, again, this is a name we use in historiography, the dynasty that came to rule Egypt was originally from Albania. Mehmet or Muhammad Ali was an Ottoman general that was sent to Egypt to fight against the invading armies of Napoleon in 1805, and eventually he established himself in Egypt, and through the 1830s he conquered Palestine and Syria, and eventually, in 1840s was stopped by a coalition of forces, including the Ottomans, the British, and the French. And while he relinquished Palestine and Syria to the Ottomans, he was able to create his own dynasty, which lasted up until the 1950s, ruling Egypt. Now, what happened to Jerusalem is that in these 10 years of Egyptian rule, so-called Egyptian rule, we have a massive administrative transformation. We have creation of ruling councils, the establishment of a basic form of municipality, which eventually was established by the Ottomans when they took over in the 1860s. And what we see, the transformation of social life, opening of coffee houses, cellar bars, and we start having reports from Western visitors of these amazing transformations, which were, and I use the word, unbelievable by Western standards. So at least they never thought they would see this in the Orient. And yet this was, a transformation led by locals, obviously inspired by the West, but mostly led by locals, which also took the shape and form of sort of an Oriental, let's use this word, standards. So obviously coffee houses were slightly different from coffee houses in London as in Vienna or Paris, but the purpose was exactly the same. A gathering of men where, discussions about politics took place, whether national, international, local politics, newspapers were read aloud, and so people were informed. So it's important to understand that, Jerusalem developed its own modernity well before World War I, well before the arrival of the British. And, in time, we also have elections, as I mentioned, the opening of the Jaffa-Jerusalem Railway, which some historians, and I agree, not only connected Jerusalem to Jaffa, but connected Jerusalem to Europe. And this is the moment where many historians working on Jerusalem, starting in the early 2000s, we start thinking about Jerusalem as an imperial city, a city that was connected to the rest of the world, but being part of the Ottoman Empire. Now we see that Jerusalem became also an imperial city, or remained an imperial city under the British, but that empire expanded the outreach of Jerusalem beyond Europe. It became a really, truly worldwide city. So just to give you a sense, and you can see there's a picture of Jerusalem with the Jaffa Gate, and on top of Jaffa Gate you see a tower, which was a clock tower. The Ottomans inaugurated a large number of the clock towers, which represented a secular identity and the idea of standardizing time throughout the Ottoman Empire. Unfortunately, in Jerusalem did not survive because the British governor of Jerusalem thought it was ugly and not in tune with the religious character of Jerusalem. So when the British took over, the tower was demolished. But a similar tower still exists in Jaffa, and it's the very center of Jaffa. And if you visit Jaffa, you can certainly see in the very heart of a city. And you can see also a picture on a map that shows the administrative division. So obviously, Palestine did not exist as an administrative unit. It was a term used mostly across the Mutasarraflik, so the province of Jerusalem, up to the province of Acre or Akko, which was another province. So in general, people would define themselves according to local identities, yet the idea of Palestine, so Palestine existed. We have a presence, obviously, of a newspaper published in Jaffa by a Christian family called Al-Filastin. In general, the news reported are literally covering from the Negev, so nowadays Beersheba, Gaza, Jerusalem, Haifa, up north to Akko. So roughly speaking, this is sort of a area we are looking at. And just a series of pictures about modernity. The train station, which you can still see in Jerusalem nowadays. Nowadays, it has become some sort of a permanent market, Luna Park, trail for runners and bikers. But the train station is there. And talking about heritage, since we're talking about the foundation, it's interesting that the train station existed, but it was forgotten for decades. In Jerusalem, the train station was synonymous to drugs. It was a place for junkies. And it's only in the last 15 years that even the Israeli administration of Jerusalem began to recover the heritage of the Ottoman times. They did it for political reasons. I'm not going into it. But it's important that the heritage of that era did not fully disappear, and eventually in time has been recovered. And the train station is one of them. And then, of course, you can see, hospitals, which have been built under the Ottomans. This is a picture of a yellowish picture, a Jaffa Road, which became the commercial hub outside the city walls, where all of the Western banks, post offices, insurances, they all opened their offices. And Jaffa Gate became these polyglot streets where people spoke all sorts of different languages, and became the very hub of modern Jerusalem. So again, we're going to see in the next slide the idea of the old city, the map that many of us are familiar with, opposed to the new city, which opened in the 19th century. And we traditionally see the map of Jerusalem, the old. Nowadays, we think of the four quarters, which again is a British invention. By the 19th century, we tend to think there were about 9 quarters, maybe a little bit more, but likely 9 recognizable quarters, which had their own names. And while they may have a ethnic or religious homogeneous main bulk, the quarters were mixed. The work of Michel Campos, who did an amazing job with GAI technology. So to look at CAPU certificates, so cadastral certificates, and the Jerusalem map, he was able to overlap this data. And we see that while ownership was very homogeneous, but generally Christians would rent properties from Muslims, Jews would rent properties from Muslims too. So often you have all this overlapping, and the traditional idea of a Christian, Armenian, Jewish, and Muslim quarter really shows its limits. And we have, again, homogeneous group in the Christian quarter, Armenian, Jewish, and Muslim, But then we all different, small different units within these same quarters, and within the broader quarters, you can see that inhabitants were not necessarily belonging to the same, major group living in the area. I always like to, use the example of one of my good friends, Bedros Dermatosian, who is an Armenian historian working at the University of Nebraska, working mostly on Armenian history, both in Palestine and Armenia. He grew up in the Islamic quarter of Jerusalem, where many Armenians used to rent houses from Muslims. So again, showing how, this, there is a degree of mixing, which today's, particularly post-1967, we saw eventually kind of like disappearing. But before that, again, obviously between 48 and 67, the Jewish quarter was not inhabited by Jews. They were expelled by, Jordanian forces. But eventually, they came back after 48. But before that period, the city was still fairly mixed. Where we see more homogeneous neighborhoods, it's outside the city. Where outside the city walls, and I'm going to show the next map, you can see where the yellow areas are. We see the emergence of neighborhoods that were mostly inhabited by Arabs, Christians, or Muslims. They live together, so they base their identity on Arabness. And then other neighborhoods that were defined by the Jewish identity. And while they neighbored each other, they remain more homogeneous than inside the city. Obviously, this happened slowly. First, it was the mostly Arab Christians that moved outside the city walls. Then some of the Muslim elites began to build outside the city walls, and the arrival of Jews from Europe prompted the building of first religious neighborhoods like Mea Sharim, which is still a religious neighborhood today, and then other areas outside the city walls where they established themselves, throughout time, and eventually developed in those areas. So again, Jerusalem developed organically throughout the Ottoman times, not necessarily with the arrival of the British. And just to give you a sense of the population pre-war times, with a few figures of 1922, which is the British census. On the eve of World War I, the population of Jerusalem is estimated to have been around 60,000, including Ottoman and foreign residents. So it's very hard to calculate exactly, the figures for each community, because often they only included male or families. So these are rough estimates. But we understand that certainly within the walls, the majority of inhabitants were Jewish. Outside the city walls, it's a little bit more complicated to have a, sort of a proper figure. But in general, historians, even if politically divided, tend to agree that by the outbreak of World War I, Jerusalem, within the wall and outside the walls, had a majority of Jewish inhabitants, maybe close to 50%. And then an equal number of Muslims and Christians, that would have constituted the Arab population. However, it's important to also highlight the fact that among the Jews of Jerusalem, many were Sephardi Jews. So Jews that had been living in Palestine for at least 5 centuries since the Reconquista of Spain. When the Jews were kicked out of Spain, many resettled in the Ottoman Empire, and a number of them resettled in Palestine, in Jerusalem. And also a number of Jews, which now we call Mizrahim, so Oriental Jews, mostly coming from other parts of the Ottoman Empire. Remember, Jerusalem is an imperial city, so there's freedom of movement, and a number of Jews from Iraq, Kuwait, Yemen moved into the Ottoman Empire before World War I. And they would have been considered Arab Jews. So they would have counted as Arab. So again, sometimes it's hard to distinguish who's who. And the majority of the inhabitants of Jerusalem pre-World War I were religious Jews. So whether Ashkenazi or Sephardi or Mizrahi Jews, most likely they would have been what we now call Orthodox Jews, so religious Jews. Zionists would move into the city mostly after 1920 with the arrival of the British. You have some settlements, colonies, certainly around Palestine. A few lived in Jerusalem, outside the city walls, but for the most part, they were not a relevant number, by the outbreak of a war. And you can see that the same trend continued under the British. In 1922, we have the first official census. So we have, better numbers. So obviously, the majority was still Jewish. What is interesting in terms of numbers is that Jerusalem didn't grow much between, the statistics we have around 1914 and 1922. And obviously that is due to the war. People left the city. Obviously people died because of the war, starvation, mobilization. So it took Jerusalem almost a decade to recover, the previous figures and previous growth, and mostly was because of the arrival of Zionists. And so, again, obviously the war had a major effect on the demographic of Jerusalem, both ways. One, because of the effects of the war, and secondly, because of the arrival of the Zionists in the post-1918 period. Now, I want to move to talk about the war. And what I want to do is just to give you a sense of World War I, a few things. Obviously, I'm sure you're very familiar with a broader history of World War I. July 1914, so 110 years ago, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. That triggered the outbreak of World War I. What is interesting and important for us is that the Ottoman Empire was initially neutral. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. And it's only in October that eventually joined the war effort on the side of the Germans. There's a mistake here, which I thought I corrected, but I didn't. Because what I wanted to write is that the work of a number of Turkish scholars in recent time has shown that despite the signing alliance with the Germans, there were still a number of Ottoman officials who believed that the right choice was either to remain neutral or to sign an alliance with the British. And in fact, the governor of Syria and Palestine, who is going to become an important character for us, Jamal Pasha, he was pretty disappointed with his colleague, Enver Pasha, that an alliance was signed with the Germans, as he would have preferred the French and the British, who was more familiar with. He spoke French, and they were the natural allies of the Ottomans. But eventually, the Ottoman Empire joined the war again on the side of the German-Austrian alliance, and that's history, because we know that that led to the demise of the Ottoman Empire. Now, what is important is always to remember that even during the first few weeks of war, still, when you look at diaries and memoirs and sources, you get the feeling that despite there was some sort of disappointments because the Ottomans, they joined the war effort, and many people believe that it was not the right choice, no one would have thought that the Ottoman Empire would collapse, or at least that would go, literally disappear at the end of the war. Arabs, particularly those that were involved into new forms of Arab nationalism, believed that an Arab nation should have emerged, but still within the Ottoman Empire. The work of Louis Fishman for Palestine and others for Lebanon and Syria really shows that you have all of these ideas about nationalism, and yet, the idea of an Arab nation was still connected to the Ottoman Empire. So the Zionists, particularly those in Palestine, there was an office in Jaffa, one in Jerusalem, and obviously one in Istanbul, which played a major role for the Zionists in the empire throughout the war. For them, a Zionist entity of some form and shape was going to emerge, but still within the framework of the Ottoman Empire. And so it's important that at the beginning of the war, still that was the idea. The Ottoman Empire was not going nowhere. It could have been changed form and shape. There were ideas about a federation, cohabitation, confederations. You find different names in different languages. But essentially, all of that was to be blended by Osmanlı, Ottoman identity. However, the war changed all of that. And so let's now focus on Jerusalem, because obviously when war was declared, what we see is the mass mobilization of people and resources. Now, to be fair, mobilization started before the outbreak of the war, when the Ottoman Empire declared what they called in jargon armed neutrality. So the idea was to mobilize, but to remain neutral. So the Ottomans started mobilizing, for the most part, ideological resources, and one of them was the abolition of the capitulation. The capitulations were these treaties signed when the Ottomans were the superpower of the day, which favored of the Ottomans in the 16th century, but by the 19th century became treaties that favored the Western powers in the Ottoman Empire, and they were particularly felt in some areas of the Ottoman Empire, and one of them was Jerusalem, where essentially Westerners had the upper end in all business treaties, in all diplomatic issues, and even legal issues, to the point that the capitulations allowed the principle of extraterritoriality to be implemented. So in Jerusalem, we have frequent cases that were tried through international courts rather than Ottoman courts, because foreigners began to use to their own advantage, the capitulation. Not only that, but also Christians for the most part, and also Jews, could claim the status of protege, which was extended by the French, the Russians, the Italians, the Germans, or any European power that had a consulate in Jerusalem, and there were many, would have extended protection to minority. And so, Jerusalemites had a direct experience of the capitulations, and the abolition was celebrated with festivities. And, we have a picture here of the sort of mobilization process, and there are several pictures too that coincided also with celebration for the abolition of the capitulation. Eventually, with the beginning of the war, we obviously have the declaration of martial law. All men, regardless of their religious affiliations, were mobilized and enlisted in the army. Christian and Jews served, some in labor battalions, some, serving through other services. But again, because of the reforms that occurred in the 1850s in the Ottoman Empire, now they are no longer considered excluded, even though they could still pay a tax and be excluded from military service. But many did serve in the army with their fellow Muslim Jerusalem inhabitants. Now, some Christians obviously chose not to serve and to stay home, and we're going to see one of them was Joaria, even though his brother actually served in the army, because sometimes they used again connections with consular presence, particularly of neutral countries, and or their wealth. And so a number of Christians coming from, sort of a upper middle class, they were able to stay. But the numbers suggest that there were not as many as we may think, even though, again, sometimes, particularly after the war, with the creation of certain historical narratives, all of this was distorted, and the history of what happened in this period of time became highly politicized and highly political, and so numbers were used to justify, to explain, to serve as claims for various groups, and we lost in time really what was the real picture. Now, I just want to share a few pictures here, obviously part of a mobilization. So you can see Ottoman soldiers with the Ottoman banner. And again, it's very hard to distinguish who's who. Could have been Muslim, Christians, Jews together. Obviously, there's an important picture here of the Ottoman. One is Jamal Pasha, so he would have been the military governor of Syria and Palestine, but also one of the three men that ran the Ottoman Empire, Jamal Pasha, Enver and Talat. Enver and Talat are very important, particularly in relation to the history of the Armenians. They were those that designed and perpetrated the Armenian genocide. Jamal Pasha, quite interestingly, was not involved, or at least directly involved, as Enver and Talat. In fact, Jamal Pasha, quite interestingly, welcomed the Armenians that survived the death marches throughout the desert, and many resettled in Palestine and in Jerusalem, to the point that in Jerusalem we have two communities of Armenians, one of the original Armenian communities dating back centuries, and the other one that was shaped and formed with the arrival of the survivors of the Armenian genocide. There are various speculations why he chose not to finish the job, but to allow for Armenians to literally be rescued. But again, that goes into the realm of speculations because we don't really have enough evidence to prove the reasons, whether political, in opposition to the other leaders, whether because his personal friendship with the Armenian patriarch. But again, we don't really know. It's certainly true that Jamal Pasha took an interest against the Arab nationalism. And this is where I want to begin to talk about some of the characters that shaped wartime Jerusalem. But I want to mention a couple of things because I'm going to talk about diaries and memoirs. And I think it's important to remember that when we talk about diaries and memoirs, we talk about individuals who experienced firsthand certain events and then wrote them down on a daily basis, or recollected them later in time, and maybe that memory was tainted by a sense of nostalgia, about poor recollections, or ideological reasons, political reasons. And so we need to take diaries and memoirs with a pinch of salt. And yet, given that we don't have as many as you can find of the Western Front, for instance, these are windows on Palestine, on Jerusalem, during the war, in a period of time that honestly we don't know much about. Jerusalem during the war was isolated from the rest of the world, only connected with the rest of the Ottoman Empire. Obviously, like all of the other cities, experienced censorship. So letters, exchange of postal matters was minimal. It underwent local censorship, sometimes even German Austria censorship. And so, it's very hard to have information about the city in this period of time, if not through diaries and memoirs. And so it's important, for historical purposes to work with the sources and at the same time to be wary of what they're talking about, to be, thoughtful in our understanding and try to read them, bear in mind their own context and their own understanding of how events were unfolding in that period of time. But as I said, there's been for a long period of time these sources, some of them were known, but completely neglected. Just historians choose not to work with diaries and memoirs. Again, the early 2000s, Avigail Jacobson, a very important Israeli scholar now at Hebrew University, for instance, discovered the diary of this young gentleman, Ihsan Turjman, and eventually translated by Salim Tamari, Palestinian scholar. And, working in tandem, Palestinian Israeli scholars really helped to discover new sources, but also allowed us to understand what was going on in Jerusalem during wartime. And Ihsan Turjman is a very interesting example. He was a local recruit. He worked for Jamal Pasha. He had a military training, but essentially served in the administrative unit following the governor of Syria, Palestine, they said Jamal Pasha. And his diary is a window over wartime. And he talks about Jerusalem showing and discussing hunger, poverty, prostitution, questions of identity, nationalism, but also parties that were taking place throughout Jerusalem. So daily life, intercommunal relation. Ihsan Turjman is Muslim, but he's also, well connected with the Christian counterpart. He knows Jews. And, his diary is really focusing on hardship, shortage of food and misery. And what is interesting, he is complaining about the war, but he's pointing the finger against the Ottomans. And throughout his diary, you get this sense that this long-term alliance of the Arabs with the Turks under the Ottomans was coming to an end. And he's, you know, looking here at the diary, in May 24th, 1915, he writes, "I write this with my mind totally preoccupied. I cannot think of anything except our present misfortune. When will we finish this wretched war? And what will happen to us next? Our lives are threatened from all sides. A European war and an Ottoman war, prices are skyrocketing, a financial crisis, and the locusts." And I'll talk about the locusts later, because this is the real heritage of World War I in Jerusalem, at least in terms of memory, are attacking the country north and south. On top of all of this, now infectious diseases are spreading throughout the Ottoman land. Typhus is spreading in Jerusalem. So you really get a sense of how dire was the situation. Famine, locusts, but also questions about the future. What will happen to us next? And he's already injecting this idea that the Arabs were going to be separated from the Turks of the Ottoman Empire, from the other ethnic group. And so he writes in a previous note, but I wanted to give you a sense about all of this. In the previous note already he's reflecting upon that and said, "I know that the days of this Ottoman states are numbered. There is no doubt that it's heading for dissolution sooner or later. But what will be the fate of Palestine after the war?" And there are two major points. First of all, he's talking about Palestine, right? As I said earlier. And again, this is very important for political reasons. You know, the fact that obviously people acknowledge and identify themselves as Palestinians. You know, obviously the borders would have been different from the British one, but there is a sense of a Palestinian identity. He is using the word Philistine. And also talking about, that's it, you know, this Ottoman state as we know it now, it's gone. What's going to be next? We don't know. And then, again, moving forward, 1916, again, he's talking about no more crops in the city. Jerusalem has not seen more difficult days. Bread and wheat are not available anymore. The municipality, until recent, used to distribute free bread to the poor after 9 o'clock. Not anymore. And I remember going home from military headquarters at 11 o'clock at night. I'm adding this because I remember from the original diary using the specific time for the PM, so the night time. Seeing a long line of women coming from bakeries, grabbing pieces of black bread, the likes of which I've never seen. They used to fight over this bread and wait for it till midnight. There's no food. And obviously speaks about the fact that, you know, there's suffering, people dying of starvation. We have stories, no evidence of potential cannibalism. Again, these are stories that circulated everywhere, not just in Jerusalem, that, you know, mothers that would have children, you know, breastfeeding dead children for days and eventually eating, you know, again, these are stories, you know, we know how they come about. They're reported. And, you know, here you get the sense of a famine. And at the same time, you know, Itan Turjman disappeared from history for a long time. Despite they really gave us this very vivid account on how people lived. Now, Itan Turjman died. We don't know exactly the circumstances, but it was a very unfortunate moment. He was moving away the city during the retreat of the Ottomans. He was hit by a bullet, possibly shot by a fellow Ottoman soldier, not by the British. The circumstances are unclear, but he died very young in 1917. The diary is very dark. It speaks about some of the, you know, common life, communal life. But I think, you know, when you read the diary, you start sympathizing and empathizing with him. You really suffer firsthand. But he also talks about, you know, for instance, his girlfriend, the possibility of getting married after the war. So there's also, you know, personal life, which gives us a sense of humanity. And a sense of humanity comes from the next character. She's a fascinating character. To be honest, she didn't leave us any diary, any memoir. And what we know about her is reported in other diaries and memoir in the work that I carried out with Salim Tamari and another scholar, actually he's a physician turned into scholar, living in Palestine, Norbert Schwacke, a retired German physician that chose to live in Nazareth and fascinated with German history in Palestine. So Leah Tenenbaum was the daughter of a Tenenbaum, a Jewish family that moved, roughly speaking, at the late 18th century, probably early 19th century. They were religious Jews. She was born in Mea Shearim. But we know for a fact that by the outbreak of the war, Leah Tenenbaum was known as the Beauty Queen of Jerusalem, which eventually became a title of a famous novel written by Israeli writer. Possibly he kind of grabbed few details of the story of Leah Tenenbaum. Now, Leah Tenenbaum was the mistress of Jamal Pasha. He was a well-known character in Jerusalem. Everyone in Jerusalem would have known him, to the point that the Spanish consul in 1915, writing in his diary, and obviously we're going to talk about Conde de Bayobar, wrote, "The month is ending, but not the more or less naughty comments being made about the projected wedding of Jamal Pasha with a beautiful Jewish lady named Leah Tenenbaum. The news seems so unlikely to me that I gave it the least importance, but it persists, and there is no one in the city who is not commenting on it." I find it fascinating. There's gossip going around. There's war, there's famine, people dying, there's starving. There's also a living city. And I think this is important to remember, things are moving on. And we can see that, nowadays, you think about the conditions in Kiev, in Kherson, in other cities in Ukraine, and even in Gaza, where I have a couple of friends who recently started an Instagram page showing, whenever they have internet, a bit of daily life. But that's not new. It's not about social media. It existed before. And I felt like, this is an extremely fascinating character because he was on the lips of everybody in Jerusalem during the war. Her character disappeared. Eventually, for viewers of you are interested, he married an Egyptian Christian who moved from Egypt into Palestine. He was a famous lawyer, Abkarius, who built for her a villa, Villa Lea, that you can see in the picture. Villa Lea is still in Jerusalem, and it's open once a year. Like everywhere in the world, you have these open houses, and so you can visit the city, the villa that is dedicated to Villa Lea. Villa Lea is important because during the British Mandate was inhabited by the Emperor of Ethiopia, which was kicked out by the Italians in 1936, and eventually was inhabited by Moshe Dayan in 1967 when he conquered the city of Jerusalem. So it had also very illustrious residents. Eventually, Leah Tenenbaum moved to Egypt, married a British official, divorced. He had a child with an Egyptian officer. He moved to Switzerland and eventually died in Canada, where she changed name. And that was the very hard part, the hardest part of the project, try to find her, where eventually she was buried in Montreal in 1967. But it's interesting because, again, it gives us the hint of what was going on in Jerusalem. Albert Antebi, very important Jew in Palestine, in Jerusalem, had her working as a secretary because she was polyglot. She spoke multiple languages. And so she's a character that you can find in different stories, in different diaries and memoirs. And then, one of my favorites, because this is part of, very much my job, my work, Conde de Bayobar. Conde de Bayobar, Antonio de la Sierva y Levita, is interesting, tells us that the mother was actually Jewish, a convert to Christianity, Catholicism, arrived in Jerusalem as a very young consul in 1913, and he started writing a diary. The diary that I published in English is very short compared to the full diary in Spanish that I've seen, in the family, but essentially 2/3 of the diary are about financial questions that he was talking about in relation to his family, his wealth, so not very relevant. So the diary that I edited using the Spanish edition, changing a few things here and there, is very much about his experience in Jerusalem during the war. And, it got, forgotten for decades because he's Spanish, he wrote in Spanish, and so many Western scholars don't read Spanish, and nobody paid attention. And yet he gives us this very interesting view of Jerusalem during the war. Certainly, he was interested in his own, questions about the Catholic institutions, local government, consuls, but at the same time, he was talking about, local conditions while talking about Christian churches. And so, through his writing, we really get a sense of what's going on in the city. And as mentioned earlier, gossip, but also parties, also availability of food, who's controlling properties, gossip about the local families, Palestinians, about the Jews, the Zionists. So we have a constant flow of information. Obviously, you need to expunge them from, his writing, but it's there, and it's very important. So he witnessed crucial events like the evacuation of Jaffa, which is interesting because for decades in Zionist historiography painted the evacuation of Jaffa before before the British arrived, as some sort of a massacre of Jews, which also had been very complicated because even the Jews that survived, never painted it as a massacre. But eventually, like the diary of Bayobar, who investigated the matter, actually shows that most of the Jews left for the colonies in the north or for Jerusalem. And of course, some died on the way, particularly the elderly or the sick. So, it helped us to revise that historiography, to, get a better sense of what happened in Palestine during World War I. And also, obviously, it cherished the arrival of the British. But up until a few days earlier, he was, allow me this American expression, best buddy with Jamal Pasha. He talks extensively about how many times they had tea, they played together cards, they had conversations. Yes, one can say, well, he had to do that. He's a consul, and he certainly wanted to keep Jamal Pasha on his side. But, many times he was frank about him. He painted him as a fairly nasty individual. But what is interesting, as soon as the British arrived, he never even mentioned that he developed some sort of a friendship with him. Even, we may say, critical friendship, but he did. What is important here, and I just mentioned a couple of entries, for instance, March 1915. I'm frankly impressed because last night near my house, they hanged two poor devils accused of espionage. One of the sentences was a Christian from Gaza, and the other a Muslim from Sudan. The Ottomans, particularly Jamal Pasha, was paranoid with spies. More importantly, he was paranoid with spies that were associated with nationalist organizations. So Arabs that were believed to be associated with one of his nationalist movements and or with a spy network were hanged. And what is interesting, for instance, the only hanged Zionists were those that were accused and tried to despise the famous Neely network. But most of the Zionists in Jerusalem that Jamal Pasha had issues with were exiled, mostly to Syria throughout the war. So again, it really shows that Jamal Pasha was a very interesting character in relation to the Armenians, the Zionists, but he was very much afraid of Arab nationalists. He considered them the main threat to the stability and the survival of the empire. In June 1915, Comité de Bayobar obviously talked about the locusts once again. As I'm reading the Bible, it serves as an illustration to see the millions and millions of little locusts that one sees everywhere in the country and in the city. I'll go back to the locusts in a few minutes to give you a sense that everybody in their diaries and memoir is talking about the locusts. And eventually we see that what really marked the history of Palestine in Jerusalem in the eyes of those who experienced World War I is not the war itself, certainly famine, poverty, but the locust. The locust is what was left in the memory of the people. So let me move to another character, Wasif Juwaria. Wasif Juwaria is a fascinating character that changed literally the historiography of Palestine in Jerusalem in the past 10 years, mostly because his memoirs and diaries, that have been published together, tells us a lot more that we didn't know about intercommunal relations. Obviously, all that material had been to be matched with other sources, being interpreted and to be taken with a pinch of salt. But Wasif Juwaria painted a very different picture from the historiography that we used to have up until the early 2000s. City divided, communities against each other, riots, violence. We knew that there was not the real life in Palestine, in Jerusalem, but certainly the diaries and memoirs of Joe Aria opened, the way for many historians to revise that. And so, he left us with this mixed diary and memoir, which again, the part of the memoir was written in the post-1948 era, when he was an exile in Lebanon as a Palestinian refugee, coming from a wealthy Christian family. He lost everything. So his memories were fairly bitter by then. But yeah, mixing the diaries and that he wrote, some entries back in the day with the memoirs, you get a fairly good picture of Jerusalem in wartime and even earlier. And so, he writes, the country had joined the warring countries overnight, and citizens, particularly in the Arab countries, lurked in the expectation, for they had great hope for liberation for the oppressing occupier. I think this is very important. Obviously, this is written later, but already in some bits of the diaries, you get a sense that Arabs, yes, there were Ottomans, fought alongside the Ottomans, but they were already expecting a future as Arabs within the Ottoman Empire, like Isan Turjman said earlier. A few days after the war was declared, I was on my way from our home. When exiting through Damascus Gate, I saw the first Arab to be executed, hanging on high wooden gallows. My speculation is that this is the same Arab described earlier by Bayobar, because the dates kind of coincide. And again, this tells us that obviously executions happen, not in the same way as in Lebanon, for instance, where Jamal Pasha was known in Arabic as Safa, the butcher, and there's still the main square in Beirut is Martyr Square, martyrs of World War I, of those Arab nationalists that were executed by Jamal Pasha. In Jerusalem, this was less frequent, and often, again, as I said, connected to the fact that some of these Arabs were also allegedly working as spies. And then again, food prices rose dramatically due to the army's tyranny and despotism. They confiscated the foodstuff store in the foreign establishment, and they had seized as well as grains, oil, and even textiles from markets and from Jerusalem's well-known merchants. And here again, you get to see that he basically complaining about the fact that everything was taken by the Ottoman forces, who were essentially very poorly supplied by the Ottoman government, and so they relied on whatever they could find in cities, Damascus, Aleppo, and obviously Jerusalem. And then, moving forward, fast forward to December 1917, when Sunday night, December 1917, dawned on Jerusalem, the city had fallen overnight into the hands of the English and their allies. What is interesting is that a few pages later, he's reflecting upon this event, and he's wondering whether it had been a blessing or not. So obviously, post-1948, he's revising what he wrote in 1917 and thinking that, well, maybe the fact that the Ottomans were gone was not as a good idea as I thought back then, because then the British arrived and they left, the country to the Zionists. So obviously, this is part of the reflection of what happened in the past decade. Now, I just want to mention briefly a character which I found fascinating, even though he was only a Jerusalemite, and this is the last character I want to mention. Yehuda Amon. He was a Jerusalemite coming from a Turkish family, part of the elite. He served in the Ottoman army. In fact, he served alongside other famous individuals, like David Ben-Gurion, founding father of Israel, was conscripted into the Ottoman army. By then, was studying in Istanbul to become a lawyer. And while they did not serve together, they knew each other. There are references, obviously. And, he served in the army, and he wrote a diary, a very complex diary to read, because it was written in different periods of times, sometimes entries mixed. The diary was only discovered a few years ago, put together by an Israeli scholar, and it doesn't really talk about politics or give us a sense of a cultural context, but what is interesting is that as a Jew from Jerusalem, when he talks about the experience of the war, he's reflecting on the fact that he was considered an Ottoman soldier. And several times he's reporting that other soldiers were asking about his identity. When he says that he's Jewish, there is no sense of anti-Semitism, as we would say today. So there is no rejection of his Jewish identity. He's a soldier like all of the others. Again, it's important because he's receiving news from home, so from Jerusalem, and he's talking in his diary while serving in Anatolia about the locusts. So again, he's injecting Palestinian news, Jerusalem news into his diary, which is for the most part based in Anatolia. And then again, he's talking about Zionism, the Ottoman administration, and so you get some information about this kind of relationship from a Jewish perspective, or at least of a Jew that considers himself as an Ottoman Jew. He spoke Turkish, he spoke Arabic, so he saw himself as not necessarily part of this Zionist project. In fact, the majority of Sephardi and Oriental Jews were not Zionist supporters. Now, let me move to the locust as I reach the end of our sort of, discussion. And, the American colony, which is an important institution in Jerusalem, funded by American religious settlers coming in the late 19th century, they had certain individuals who took amazing pictures of this period of time. They're all free and available at the Matson collections, the Library of Congress. And here you can see that men and women were mobilized to burn and destroy locusts and the eggs of the locust. Every adult, every child had to burn, destroy, collect eggs. And, the Ottomans gave them targets, kilos per day, to destroy or collect. And remember, there were international news. Obviously, America was not yet part of the conflict. So through the work of missionaries, mostly in Syria, but they received news from Palestine. So we have news published in 1915 on the New York Times, calling distress in Jerusalem, many deaths from starvation, reported plague of locusts. And talking about heritage and memory, in the 1980s, the University of Bethlehem began a project to interview recording cassettes, which nowadays my children don't even understand the concept of cassettes, obviously, even if I showed some of them. They began to record oral history of the survivors of World War I. Elderly who experienced the war as adults, but even children who now by the 80s were obviously adults, elderly. And what is interesting, listening to the recordings and reading the transcript, is that they all talked about a cross line, whether they couldn't interview many Jews, very few, so mostly Arab, Christian, and Muslim, but they all talked about the same issues: starvation, famine, prostitution, so women that had to sell their bodies. But the overarching memory, and I call this part of the heritage of the war, was the locust. They all remember the invasion of locust 1915. And that's why Salim Tamari, when he wrote the book about Islam Turjuman, called that the year of the locust. Because there is this expression that all of them remember the war through the lenses of the locust, which worsened starvation caused by the Allied blockade, by the poor distribution of food by the Ottomans and the Germans, by the fact there were war profiteers who kept the food in food depots, mostly in Syria and Lebanon. But everybody suffered, even the upper classes, from the arrival of the locusts. So World War I in Jerusalem and in Palestine has always been remembered as the year of the locust. However, that was not the end of the war, because when the British arrived, obviously, then there became another pivotal moment. And Arabs began to remember the arrival of the British, not necessarily through the date, December 1917, December 9, which is the date in Jerusalem surrender. December 11 is when Allenby took officially the city, but mostly because of the Zionist, promise, the Balfour Declaration, And so Arabs began to internalize the war no longer through the eyes and the memory of the locust, but through more political terms. And again, that's obviously part of the development of nationalism and Zionism. Let's go back to December 9, 1970. Obviously, this is a famous date for the history of Jerusalem. There was no real war, battle fought over the city. The Ottomans understood that for political and propaganda reasons, it would have been better just to leave the city, and they did so. So Bayobar says, a day famous in history. We say in Spain that with a new year, there is new life, but this time I would have to say, the day December 9, 1970, ... new life. And again, you know, it's interesting because just a few weeks earlier, we're still talking about the Ottomans, but now that's gone. The British have arrived. And, you know, the day after, the enthusiasm of the people seems to me be still on the increase. Later on, that changed, obviously. Still, people were very happy. The British brought food, brought supplies. They even fixed the pipes and they brought water. So obviously, you know, people are very practical, very pragmatic. The new rulers were bringing food. Welcome to the British. Now, the city change ends once again, you know, 4 centuries earlier, with the Ottomans took over from the Mamluks, and the Mamluks earlier from other dynasties and so forth. And Allenby chose to enter on foot. So unlike the German Kaiser, he entered on foot with no real celebration, no ceremony, no religious, no national symbol, and all of that was done in opposition to the visit of the Kaiser, the picture we saw at the very beginning. Allenby read a proclamation announcing martial law and the keeping of a status quo, which was already in place under the Ottomans. So no one could have touched religious places, no one could have changed anything. However, and I'm just going to use the last character, everything was about to change. And a man that changed everything for Jerusalem, at least in the urban planning, was Ronald Storrs. Ronald Storrs was the byproduct of the British education of the upper classes. He actually studied Arabic in Cambridge. He's one of the pioneers of my own alma mater, the School of Oriental and African Studies, which opened in 1916 with the purpose to produce elite officers who would have spoken Oriental languages. And T. Lawrence, doesn't need introduction, wrote of him. The first of all of us was Ronald Storrs, Oriental Secretary of the Residency in Cairo, the most brilliant Englishman in the Near East, and subtly efficient. Despite his diversion of energy in love of music and letters, of sculpture, painting, of whatever was beautiful in the world's food, Storrs was always first and the great man among us. And the reason why I quote this, because he really changed Jerusalem. Most of the features that you can see today in Jerusalem, the fact that Jerusalem is built on white stone, divided in certain neighborhoods, the fact that you don't find commercial signs within the old city, brothels were removed from the old city, and the idea of building a green belt around the old city, this is all due to Ronald Storrs. He was named military governor and then civilian governor until 1960. What is interesting is that nobody knows about him in Jerusalem. People would remember Allenby, the general conquered. But despite the fact that Ronald Storrs shaped modern Jerusalem, he denied the building of a modern tram, which was approved by the Ottomans in 1911, halted because of a war, and only picked up recently by the Israeli administration because it was not in line with the sacred character of Jerusalem. And in my view, the lack of a tram stopped the possibility of various communities to communicate with each other, who became more and more homogeneous and more distant from each other. So, having said that, just a few, some concluding remarks here. The war marked the end of Ottoman rule in Jerusalem and Palestine. However, despite the narrative written for decades, really, in administrative terms, we can observe a lot more continuity than one may have expected. Certainly, what we appreciate more changes is in terms of communal relations. With arrival of the Zionists, the strong emergence of Arab nationalism, those relationships painted by all diaries and memoirs that we have of communal relations. They disappeared in time. Jerusalem now became a British imperial city. And I think this is important because now you start seeing in Jerusalem Indian, more, different, inhabitants of the British Empire, South Africans, Australians, they are coming, visiting, staying, some are officers coming for tourism. And some of them experience, the life under the British mandate, and they left us with diaries and memoirs too. And again, in terms of historical narrative, they, narrative painted the arrival of the British as the true modernizing moment in the history of the city. One, however, can say that the British, in my view, actually did the opposite. They demunicipalized Jerusalem. This is a word that I coined with a good friend of mine, Palestine Naili, an historian of the late Ottoman era of Palestine, because Jerusalem essentially became the realm of Roland stores, and the activity of municipality disappeared. And after Roland stores, the municipality again never regained any foothold up until the Jordanians or the Israeli came in 1948. And what happened is that the British, particularly Roland store, crumbled centuries of local intra-communal relations, making Jerusalem what it looked like essentially ever since, a city of conflict, strife, and division. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Roberto. If you'd like to stop sharing, we will take questions. Fascinating story about Jerusalem. If anyone has a question, please turn your video on, wave your hand, or use the Zoom chat. What I'll do is I will pick up a couple of questions I think that Ferdous Intaj or Fred posed during the talk. And one quite intriguing, in your statistics about the population evolution over time, it seemed in between 1896 and 1905, there was quite a significant drop. And I may have missed it, but what was the reason for that drop in particularly the Jewish population there?
Very much about the counting system. So the Ottomans used the system based on families. So we are not entirely sure exactly in terms of like single individuals, but the moment they changed the system into households, not only for Jerusalem, but we noticed a decreasing population throughout Palestine of certain communities. So the speculation of many historians is that some communities try not to register in order to avoid taxation. So it's possible that the numbers actually increased, but officially they decreased. And that remains a problem for those who are working on sort of a demographic history of Palestine, but in general of the Middle East.
Okay. And one thought I was having, and you emphasized that the striking memory perhaps of the population of the war was the plague of locusts. But is it the case that there was not much fighting and destruction? I mean, if you were in another city during the war that was directly in the path of conflict, you might have remembered it differently. Is that a fair observation?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say that, for instance, a few colleagues who are working on Lebanon, particularly on Beirut, they would say that the war is remembered through the lenses of this anti-Arab, really not just feelings, but given that Jamal Pasha became Mustafa, the butcher, the martyrs that were executed in the main square. So while fighting is not that relevant in the Middle Eastern front, we don't really have major battles, like for instance, Gallipoli. Major battles took place around the Suez Canal, partly around Gaza, but the memory of the war is very much connected to local events. So like in Beirut, is connected to literally the execution of Arab nationalists in Jerusalem and other Palestinian cities is connected to the Holocaust. That's where they experienced the war at the worst, really. So yeah, absolutely. I would agree that it's fair to say that it's connected to local and different experiences. In general, we don't see trenches, so there's no trench warfare memory other than in Gallipoli for a little bit and around the Suez Canal. So, it's a very different kind of memory from what we have, on the Western Front, for instance, where soldiers may have been deployed in different parts, but sometimes they have similar memories. The trenches were very similar in terms of lifestyle, conditions, and so forth.
Another thought, it was very good to have the personal records from those diaries. Was there an active press? Were there papers active during the war? Were those useful sources at all?
This is a very important question. So the Ottomans censored all local newspapers. Some kept publishing some news, but very little. So the only press that was allowed actually was the Austrian-German press. So we do have some information from them, but obviously, this is a press that underwent a lot of censorship. But frankly, it's interesting how later on the German-Austrian press actually, for instance, reported, you can find the issues published in Istanbul about the loss of Jerusalem, which for them was a loss. So it's interesting how they reported, because obviously losing Jerusalem was a dramatic event too. And so I wonder if censorship really worked as hard as it looked like. The idea that they talked about the loss, maybe it was going to work as a propaganda to say we have to reconquer Jerusalem, but in the end you find some information. But for the most part, we don't have much press available. The Ottomans censored all the local newspapers, and so very much second-hand from German press. There's some press coming through, like the British consul, the American consul, the Spanish consul, but again, most of that was censored upon arrival. So sometimes they only receive press cuts of the New York Times or the Spanish consul called La Prensa, so the Spanish press, but very little, very, very little.
Thank you. Has anyone else got any questions or comments for Roberto? I've got one last question. I'm intrigued by the railway. So the Jerusalem to Jaffa railway, was that a branch off the Damascus to Mecca?
And Medina, yes.
Medina.
Ideally should have served the branch. It never really did. I mean, there's been times where the problem, and again, I'm not an expert, and I hope to use the right word, was about the gauge, if I remember well. So the fact that sometimes it didn't work, they had to relocate the train itself, and so it never fully worked. But ideally, would have been part of the Hijaz Railway project, so to connect Istanbul to the holy places of Mecca and Medina.
And presumably during the war, that connection to Jaffa did not help in the transport of food or goods, or
very little. Even because it's a very convoluted series of tracks through the hills separating. So there's about 20 kilometers, about 50 miles or so from Jaffa up to the beginning of the hills, which is straight, and then the tracks were built at the foot of the hill, so they have this kind of S shape that makes the trek very long and very uncomfortable. And then the last bit would have been, uphill, and so all trains struggled. So it was not very profitable nor comfortable, to the extent that still the old routes with donkeys would still serve many travelers from Jaffa to Jerusalem.
And I just written another thought that crossed my mind. I was intrigued by that map of the sort of, let's say, the ethnic quarters of Jerusalem. And I suppose it's a lesson to be careful in interpreting maps when people divide them up into those quarters. Yeah, the boundaries are porous. And you know, I think it must be true in other cities where these divisions are equally drawn up by someone.
It was a German traveler who created the map, but in Germany it was not very successful. As soon as this work was translated into English, actually picked up very quickly, and eventually it became the standard idea of Jerusalem divided in 4 quarters. And so every traveler who travel agents, obviously cook, more importantly, they all went and traveled around Jerusalem with a map, divided, Jerusalem divided into 4 quarters, so everybody would have an idea where they were. The reality is that no, they were not, because those quarters were very, very much divided, into small units, or certainly more homogeneous than the name suggested.
Yeah. And I think that must be true also of other 19th century travel guides, which aim to present the information in a simple and understandable way for people traveling from Europe visiting the Holy Land. So I think you see it also
Absolutely.
in French guides and so on. And my very last question, because I know we're pretty much out of time, tell us a little bit about the Jerusalem Quarterly, what it is that it covers, your role there, and what sort of contributions you're looking for. How can we and our audience engage with that publication?
So I take the chance to talk about 2 things, really. One is Jerusalem Quarterly, which is a publication of the Institute of Palestine Studies, the parallel publication, the Journal of Palestine Studies, which is sort of broader in many ways, focusing on Palestine. The editor is Professor Rashid Khalidi, so very famous professor, American Palestinian professor. The Jerusalem Quarterly was born to satisfy the interest of scholars and non-scholars about Jerusalem from different perspectives. So we do have obviously peer-reviewed articles, so more scholarly written pieces, but also essays which are targeting a broader audience. And the idea is to talk about Jerusalem from different perspectives, not just one discipline, so multidisciplinary approach, but also publishing letters, stories, reviews. So the idea is like to provide readers 4 times a year with materials about Jerusalem, really covering all sorts of aspects. So we have articles covering from the cats of Jerusalem to the repairing of the Al-Aqsa Mosque or the Dome of the Rock. So very diverse kind of material. Plenty of we love to have photo essays. For instance, Professor Isamna Star, who is also interested in photography, helped with the publication of a number of issues with pictures, either private collections. So often we try to get in touch with families, Christian, Jewish, Muslims. Again, politics sometimes doesn't help, but asking families if they have a photo album. And sometimes, like the Turjuman family, they actually came back to Salim Tamari and Abigail Jacobson saying, well, we also have a diary, which was, as someone would say, bingo, because we don't have many. And so we always go around and try to ask people, if you empty your cellar because, one of your relatives in the old city or in the new city of Jerusalem died, and all of a sudden you find material, please let us know. We would love to see that. And, there are scholars who would love to see that. But it's, it's hard. Again, Jerusalem underwent changes, obviously 1948, 1967, and a lot of this material just disappeared. Sometimes taken in 48, we know that. Most of it is at the Israel National Library. They recently hired, despite the current political situation, a Palestinian who is in charge of mapping the material that was taken by IDF forces in 1948. So this is a great news. But, other material disappeared, was burned, lost. And so in 1967, and so, a lot of material is out there. Hopefully one day we'll be able to access it. But if I may briefly, I also take the chance to publicize my own podcast, Jerusalem Unplugged. where I normally interview scholars, but our conversations are, very open, and they cover really the history of Jerusalem from ancient time to the contemporary. But I also like to interview, non-scholars or scholars from different disciplines, and really having conversations about Jerusalem or Palestine at large, but also with connections with the history of Jerusalem. And the last episode, I discussed a book written by a journalist about the Israel Black Panthers movement. So Mizrahi Jews borrowing the Black Panthers title from the American Black Panthers, but yet the movement was born in Musrara, that in the 19th century, early 20th century, was an affluent Palestinian neighborhood, mostly Palestinian Christians, and then Muslims during the Mandate. And in 1948 became this really border area with Jordanian Jerusalem, inhabited by Moroccan Jews who were sent there, because this was an unpleasant place to live with no services. And eventually they became the Black Panthers. So again, the history of Israel, Palestine, and Jerusalem are always intertwined.
Excellent. We'll end it there, but just to say, what you're doing with those diaries and records is very important. It's very important to us and the Levantine Heritage Foundation. It's what we aim to help with a lot of our members. That if they have records, then we are very happy to safeguard them. We have a large collection that was given birth by Jacques Cabral, focusing primarily on the Latin communities, but we have other records. And if they're ones that are relevant to your area of expertise, Roberto, I'm sure we would be delighted to share them and find an opportunity to publish them. So just to thank you very much for your presentation, very interesting. We'd love to follow up and ensure that there's a permanent record on our website. Thank you to our audience, and I wish all of you a very good evening or good day wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much once again for hosting me. Thank you.
Bye-bye.